Hello and welcome to Conflict Resolution Contentment in the Classroom, Week 6. Week 6, we need to talk about culture shock and reverse culture shock, problems with the definition of cultures, parts of cultures. Then we'll go in to explain the difference between racism and prejudice. And lastly, we'll look at ways to help in conflicts between cultures. So you might wonder why I like to talk about culture shock. And I think that the reason why we should talk about culture shock is that I feel that it happens on an everyday basis. Most people think of culture shock as the big travel to a foreign country, where you're going to learn that people have different foods that they eat, different clothing that they're going to wear, different transportation. And I think that a lot of the times when people talk about culture shock, they talk about this big travel that they've gone through a foreign country. But I think culture shock can be on an everyday basis. But before we get into that, let's look at culture shock. I like to use this picture because I remember the very first time I traveled. I've traveled to over 20 different countries. And the amount of luggage when I first traveling was probably similar to these two pictures. Now I can travel probably with a backpack and stay in a foreign country for over a month and be completely fine. But it does amuse me every single time I go to the airport to get on a plane. I see people with so much luggage. But let me give you an example of the first time that I had culture shock, and it made a big impact on my life. So this is a good example of culture shock that I have. Is when I was in South Africa, before I traveled there, I realized that there was townships. But the first culture shock I have is similar to this picture on the left of one shanty, on how realistic that these people are in poverty. These are basically tin roofs, aluminum, wood that they've found, just pieces put together. And some of these rooms are only 10 by 10, and sometimes they only will have no running water, they have no garbage areas to put, there's no bathroom facilities. So these people can live in these rooms all their life that are 10 by 10, and sometimes there's 10 to 15 people that are living in this one room. So I had such a shock seeing this. But the bigger shock that I had was when I was traveling on a freeway. I noticed that I saw a shanty home, and I saw several hundreds as I was driving on the freeway with a friend of mine. And I asked my friend, when looking at these shanty houses, why they put them so close to the freeway. And what he explained to me is, as we drove for almost 5 or 6 miles, all these shanties were lined up on the freeway. He told me that what I didn't realize is we were only seeing the end that hit the freeway, that these shanty houses go for 5 to 10 miles in the other directions. So this picture on the right here is that if you see, there is a bunch of shanty houses here. But if you look in the background here, these are all shanty houses. So the culture shock that I had was coming from suburbs of Tigard, Oregon. I never saw poverty this way. And it was such a shock and such an influence on me that it changed my view. And that's typically what culture shock is that you go into an area and you have an unknown of what somebody else's culture is. And then once you see it for real, it changes your opinion of it. So I'd like to go into something that is called reverse culture shock. And I want to give you kind of a platform of a way to explain reverse culture shock and culture shock at the same time. So looking at culture shock and reverse culture shock, how to kind of explain the two. A lot of people understand that culture shock is that going into a environment where you see different cultures, food, clothing, shelter, that's different than ours. So we have that kind of shock. So this first half of this picture here is when you first arrive in a country, a foreign country, you're going to be all excited. You got your clothes packed, you got water bottles, you got everything you need to go traveling. So you're kind of on a high. And so you're all excited about traveling there. So you arrive in country, you're seeing new sights, you're having fun, and it's exciting. But then you get into a point where the culture, because it's different than you and you see different things, then you realize that it's kind of a shock to your system. And it does cause a little bit of problems. It can cause some mental strains, some physical strains. So you have the shock of what's going on. And after being there for a while, you go through a recovery phase. And this recovery phase is things that you see on an everyday basis doesn't become so shocking to you. You start to realize, similar to when I was in South Africa, after living there for almost a year, I started to realize that shanty towns and townships were a part of life, and they didn't shock me anymore. So I started to get this almost feeling of acceptance, that this is a way of life. So the culture shock kind of goes away, and you kind of adapt to it. So this is where, in the middle, where reverse culture shock can happen, is in when you return home to the country you left from. You're all excited about going home. You're going to see your friends, your family. You're going to tell them all about the experiences that you had during your traveling time. So it's all exciting. And then you're going to come into a point where you realize that you were adapted towards and used to seeing all the other different cultures where you were in your foreign country that you visited. And that's going to start to shock you in a way similar to what the culture shock was when you first were in that foreign country. So you're going to come home after being in a foreign country and have some physical and mental strains to your body and your mind because you're not used to seeing these things that you saw in foreign countries that you've seen in your own home country. But then after again, you're going to have some recovery, and it's going to take a while, and you'll start to get used to seeing the same things that you saw in your home country. And then hopefully you're going to kind of balance out. So to give an example, let's go back to the culture shock that I had. So the culture shock that I had is when I first went to South Africa, I was all excited to go there. I had my bags packed. I was really excited. And I went there and I had my first culture shock. I started seeing these townships that really bothered me. But then after living there for a while, I started to get used to seeing these townships. And just a side note is I did some work in townships. I taught peer mediation in townships, so I was used to seeing these type of living environments. So I adapted towards it. I started to realize that this is a way of life for people. So when I came home to Oregon, I started to see houses that were like this. Big houses. I saw people with lots of land. Now, I've grown up in Oregon almost all my life, and I realized that before I went to South Africa, I kind of have an assumption that the rest of the world might live like this. But realizing now that living in South Africa, I realize that not the rest of the world lives like we do in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that there's not poverty in the United States. What I'm saying is that there is such an extensive poverty in South Africa that it gave me more of a realization of what the rest of the world lives like. So when I came back to Oregon and I started to see all this wealth, I started to have reverse culture shock, and the mental strains that I had was it bothered me that there was so much wealth in the United States and so much poverty in South Africa, that there was an unbalance of economy structure in the area that I lived in, that it started to upset me. Now, after a while, I started to get used to seeing these houses, but it started to balance out after a little bit. I've talked to a lot of people and coworkers and peers of mine that have traveled to foreign countries. And something that is a common theme that I hear, which is another example of reverse culture shock, is going to the supermarket. And when you go to the supermarket in the United States, you have hundreds of different choices. So when you walk down the cereal aisle, there is a whole aisle of different type of cereals. If you go to the soda area, you're going to have grape soda, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Mountain Dew, Sprite. There's just numerous amounts of choices. And so when you go to a foreign country, especially a third world country, the stores that you go to have a small amount of choices. For example, this is a store in a township in South Africa. Pretty sure that this store is quite different than the stores that we see in the United States. So why talk about culture shock and reverse culture shock? One of the reasons why is if we look at some of the mental and physical problems that people face with culture shock and reverse culture shock is with the mental problems with memory, inability to concentrate, poor judgment, or the physical headaches, muscle tension, nausea. All of these things are quite similar to the problems that we face in having a conflict. The second part is we always look at culture shock and reverse culture shock as, traveling to a foreign country. But it's, in my opinion, that we have culture shock and reverse culture shock every day because it's in our community. The United States is a melting pot. And that melting pot is from many different locations. One, people coming in from foreign countries into the United States. Also, if somebody's from the West Coast, or they're from the East Coast, or they're from the South, the North, all of these are different cultures. If we look at our communities in our school systems, how many communities are different culture than yourselves? And I think it's important in a school system. I worked at a school system in Portland that had over 13 different nationalities in a classroom. It also had 4 or 5 different languages in that classroom. So I think that we use this diagram almost in everyday life. We arrive at school. We're all excited about our jobs in the morning. We meet a student that has a different culture, a different awareness of us, and then we have this culture shock with them. We start to have a recovery with, after meeting that student with a different culture, we get used to seeing that different culture. We return home into our house, and that culture is different than the family that we have or our friends that we have. So we're going to have that reverse culture shock again. And then we're going to have that recovery where we're used to talking with our friends and having that culture shock of a different student or a different administrator or a different neighbor that comes into our environment. But I feel that we go through these ups and downs on a daily basis. And this can cause much conflict with us. So let's kind of switch gears and talk about the definition of cultures. Now, this is a definition of culture. This is probably one of the better definitions I've saw. Culture refers to the communication deposit of knowledge, experience, beliefs, values, attitudes, meanings, hierarchy, religion, notion of time, roles, spatial relationships, concepts of the universe, and material objects, possessions acquired by a group of people in the course of a generation through individuals and group strivings. Wow, that's a lot. And I think that there's a lot of problems with defining cultures because there are many aspects of cultures. And there's cultures within cultures. And then cultures within those cultures. You know, the culture of a family, the cultures between a brother and sister, or the cultures between a daughter and a father, or the cultures between two different neighbors, or generations of cultures, grandfathers, grandmothers with their grandchildren. So instead of defining the cultures, I think it's a better idea to look at parts of cultures. So let's look at parts of cultures. The first part is survival. What type of food do they eat? How do they get that food? The clothing, what do they wear? What are their defense mechanisms? How do they defend their environment against threats? What type of shelter do they have? In South Africa, their shelter sometimes is quite different than the United States shelter. The education system, the difference in an effort to ways cultures learn. I know that living in Europe for a while and living in the United States for a while, that culturally our education systems are different. Now, I don't want to talk about whether one education system is better or the other education is better. I just want to notice that there's a culture around education. There's also transportation, the ways in which a culture gets around and has goods and services from one place to another. Communication, this is probably one of the largest, is a way a culture shares languages. Now, we use English in the United States, but even though we use English, our terminologies in languages are quite different. There's slang in the United States. And a little conversation that I had with a friend of mine around language, which I thought was a little funny, I'd like to tell a story, is that a good friend of mine in South Africa came up to me. We were going to meet, and this person said to me that they'll meet me just now. And I looked at them confusing, like, just now? Well, just now is this minute. Just now is in this second that you're with me. You're meeting me just now. And this person said, no, I'll meet you just now, so in a little bit. And I thought that saying was so comical, but then I realized that when I put it in our terms, this person I talked to, I said, I'll meet you in just a bit. And what does that slang mean to another person in a bit? Are they going to be bit by them, or are they're only going to see a bit of me? They're only going to see my hand, my arm. So even though we share the same language as English, the communication within that is going to be different. So going on, economy, the way people in a culture exchange goods and services. Technology, the way cultures use tools. Our technology here, we have iPads, iPhones, computers. There are parts of Africa that people have never seen a computer. They still have handmade tools. And then we look at social structure, hierarchy. We have the middle class, lower class, upper class. Hindus have many different classes and many different hierarchies of social structures. Beliefs and transitions. The idea of cultures believe in the way they celebrate those beliefs. Religion. There are so many different types of religions and beliefs out there. Atheist, Buddhism, Christianity, Catholicism. Then we look at rules and regulations. These are standards and structures that are forms of the way we view structure in our communities. For example, laws. We all know we have many, many laws in this country. You can drive 65 only in Oregon, which is the highest speed limit. But in Washington, I think the highest speed limit is 75. Even though there's probably 2 miles difference between the separation of the rivers between Oregon and Washington. These are rules and standards that are in our school systems, rules on how we educate our children. There are rules in keeping people in jail or not keeping people in jail. And then the last part is arts and recreations. The way culture spend its spare time expresses itself creatively, which is such a wonderful part of cultures. The way people have different styles in music, drawings, paintings, the expression of their cultures. So before we look at ways in helping us with cultures, there's something that I want to talk about that I think that people use these terms intermittently, and I think these terms are quite different. And that is racism versus prejudice. I feel that these terms get used interchangeably a lot, and I think there is a difference between the two. And I think that it's important to, when we look at conflict, that we separate these two. So the first part is racism. And this is the belief that one race is superior than the other race. That's a key term, is that one race feels they're superior than another race. So there are all races that can have racism. Now, prejudice is a little bit different than racism. And that is that you're prejudging someone unfavorably. Before meeting them, you put stereotypes on them. And I think that the judging of that person is quite different than feeling that one race is superior than the other. One of the reasons why I think we prejudge people or we're prejudiced against people is this fear of the unknown. So if we don't know something about a culture, we try to use our surroundings and put some sort of light on what we feel their culture is. So then we may prejudge them. Also, I think that prejudice is a defense mechanism. we prejudge somebody, and this is a small example. Say you're downtown and you're in a not so well lit of an area, and you walk by somebody that's holding a gun. You're going to probably be prejudiced against that person because your body's going to go in a situation where you see a gun, you're in not the greatest area, it's dark out, and you're going to use that as a defense mechanism, saying, hey, this is maybe a bad environment, this person may be a bad person. Now, I'm not saying that prejudice is correct and we should use it every day, but there's certain times in our lives where we do prejudge somebody, and it is for safety reasons. If we feel that somebody is going to harm us, then this prejudice kind of kicks in and helps us get away from this person. But the problem is if we use it on an everyday basis, instead of getting to know someone, we already prejudge them and we put negative connotations on them. We all know about stereotypes out there. I could sit here and name hundreds and hundreds of stereotypes out there. And people rely on those stereotypes. And I think it's very unfortunate because instead of getting to know that person, we're going to create a conflict with that person because if we prejudge them, we've already put up a defensive wall against them. So in my opinion, before we use this defense mechanism, not in the case with the person with the gun, because I think the person with the gun, you should probably prejudge that person and run away. But with the person that you do not know, don't prejudge them. Try to figure out what type of person they are. So lastly, let's look at ways that we can help in cultures with conflict. First off, we have to realize the definition of conflict is when two or more people perceive a behavior act differently. Well, let's go back to these 7 parts of what is a culture. And if we look at survival, education, transportation, communication, all 10 of these are behavior acts. And that initially causes a problem because if we have 2 people that perceive a behavior act such as education, we're already causing a problem with a wall between each other. So in this situation, if we're already having a behavior act that 2 people, because of the cultural difference, perceiving the behavior act, we need to stop and understand that we're going to perceive something different than another culture. Try not to have so much of a culture shock. Try to realize that when you see somebody else that is doing something culturally different than yourself, understand that, hey, this person does something different. And it's all right that we're looking at something different. So the fear of the unknown. I think we do this, again, on an everyday basis, is that because we don't understand somebody else's culture, we automatically have this fear against it. So I think we should need to stop and learn about cultures that surround you. If you have students in your classroom that are different cultures, let the classroom learn about the cultures that are in your classrooms. If you have somebody from Africa, you have somebody from Asia or Europe, try to take those students and let them talk about their country and their history. I know that a lot of teachers do this, but I think that it's important that we teach our students the different cultures that surround us. Also, looking at cultures not in terms of right or wrong. I think that there's a lot of people out there that want to kind of divide a culture and say, hey, this part of the culture is right, this part of their culture is wrong. Instead, that we need to look at it as that it's different than ours. And different is all right. Because if everybody believed the same thing, I think the world would be a kind of a boring place. So, cut out that fear. Try to learn about the surroundings that you have. Have your students learn about the surroundings. When a student comes up to you that's a different culture, talk to them about it. Talk to them about the way they do stuff in their culture. Also, this us versus them. I think that this is a big problem in our society, is that it's really easy to say we do it this way and they do it that way. I think that we need to start to find some common ground. Instead of looking at cultures so much as they do it this way, we do it that way, is that what are similarities between our cultures? How can we kind of meet in the middle? So let's stop and look at what the journal entry is this week. So this last journal entry, not the last, week 6 journal entry is how has other cultures affected your dialogue or situations in conflicts? I look forward to seeing you or having you read the next couple articles that are on the websites. I think you'll really enjoy them. And then also the movie this week is a lot of fun because it talks about the different cultures within cultures.